You can be full and free from the slavery of your past mistakes because God raised Jesus from the dead. You can have your past no longer defined you. You now have a hope for a future. Why? Because God raised Jesus from the dead. And because God raised Jesus from the dead, that means that the power that raised him from the dead is alive in you. You've got a new kind of a life, a new kind of power, a power to live a holy life, not a sinful life, a power to do what God's called you to do and not be held captive by your weakness and the weakness of your willpower and all the things that make us frail and unsuccessful in life. If God raised Jesus from the dead, then those things no longer control us, but we can have a new life full of purpose and meaning. Those are the implications of the resurrection. And what Paul's telling Timothy is, Timothy, don't just think about Jesus generic, think about Jesus risen from the dead. There's power in that, there's meaning there. So meditate on it, think about it, preach it to yourself in the morning, sing songs about it. Remember, 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 Jesus Christ risen from the dead, offspring of David. Which if you're not a Bible person, you're like, who cares, Who's David? I thought it was Joseph, So let me give you a little bit of background there. David that's King David in the Old Testament. And the reason that this is significant is because God made King David, a promise. He promised King David that, let me just read it to you. It's 2 Samuel chapter 7. Have you got that on the screen? Here's what he told King David through the prophet Nathan. King David, when your days are fulfilled, in other words, when you die and you lie down with your fathers, I'm going to raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body. It's a biological background. And I will establish his kingdom. He's going to build a house for my name, talking about the temple that Solomon built. And I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. Now, Solomon was David's son. He fulfilled that in some degree. He built the temple, but Solomon didn't live forever. And eventually, the Davidic kingdom, the rule of David, fizzled out over a long period of time. And the Babylonian captivity happened, and they didn't have a king in Israel. And then you read the book of Judges, you see all that. It was pretty well fizzled out until Jesus comes back on the scene, and Jesus establishes his kingdom. And because Jesus was the Messiah, the Christ, the one that the Old Testament predicted in text, just like the one that I just read to you, Jesus is the one who fulfills the promise that God made in 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 13. So Paul, again, is telling Timothy, who would have had much better background of the Old Testament than you and I, Timothy, remember, God keeps his promises, not just because he raised Jesus from the dead, but because he's the offspring of David. He did what he promised he would do. Maybe they didn't see it back then. Maybe it took a long time for it to come about, but God is always faithful to keep his promises.